Okay, I think we should start because the day is short, it's Friday afternoon. Many people are already thinking about the beautiful day and going outside. But those who are engaged in the informal ECOFIN, which is actually a historical event for Slovakia because it's the first ECOFIN, the first meeting of the Ministers of Finance and Governors of Central Banks in Slovakia, in Bratislava. So for those who are engaged, it's still quite a busy time in front of us. But let me first welcome the excellencies who are here with us, the former prime ministers, ministers, people who had important positions and still continue to have important positions in different parts of life. We wanted to use this opportunity of having such great minds in Bratislava to think a little informally, that's why I have no tie, to think about what Europe is facing today, what could be responses to those new challenges, where are we going, and how we can together decide what, and at least brainstorm what the future of Europe might be. So today's panel is going to focus on those issues, on the issues of the future, of the current challenges and what is in front of us. And for many of you, it's also connected with Tatra Summit. Tatra Summit is an event actually during the presidency of Slovakia at the end of October 27, 29. This will be the main public event of the Slovak presidency of the EU. We wanted to create an opportunity for government officials, for business leaders, for representatives of civil society to come together and to talk about issues which are important for Europe, but also particularly for the region of Central Europe. So Tatra Summit, Tatra as Tatra Mountains, as part of important symbol of Slovakia, is going to be an important event. This discussion is a kind of preview of this event. I'm happy also to introduce Robert Vaš, who is the chairman and the CEO of the organization that is behind Tatra Summit, Globsec. We believe that many of you will join us again for that event. So today we will have an opportunity to kind of jumpstart the preparations for this as well. Without much more ado, I would like to introduce Jakub Wiśniewski, who is director of Globsec Policy Institute. Jakub joined this think tank, which is not only Slovak, it's actually regional, Central European think tank, recently. He's a young, bright blood from Poland in Slovakia, and we believe that he will bring a lot of new ideas and new energy to what we would like to produce out of Globsec as a think tank. So, Jakub, if I may give you the floor, and please.
Thank you very much, Vasil. Yes, my name is Jakub Wiśniewski. I am the new director of the Globsec Policy Institute and vice president of the Globsec organization. And I come from Poland and settled down in Bratislava just a month ago. The first thing that struck me when coming here was closeness to other countries, Hungary, Austria, the Czech Republic. Europe is about bridges connecting countries, societies, about making borders disappear. I don't know how you came here today, but some of you arrived from Vienna. And to see this healthy relationship between Vienna and Bratislava, this duopolis, is to understand what European integration really brings. The easier life of ordinary people. And it is clear to me, at least, how much would be lost for Slovakia if the EU ceased to exist one day. We meet in this beautiful medieval city today, and it will be a center of Europe for the next few months. We all have a lot to do. My organization, Globsec, will be involved in serious analytical work through the so-called Bratislava Initiative about future of Europe. Some people say that the EU develops quickest in the times of crisis. Well, theoretically, it would be the best time now, because wherever you look, you see crisis. Britain made a decision to leave. TTIP negotiations, transatlantic treaty, are going nowhere. Greek crisis might come back with a new force from one day to another. The North can be pitted against the South again. Also, the East can be pitted against the West in Europe. There is no consensus about the policy of quantitative easing as regards the European Central Bank. European neighborhood is literally on fire. The Minsk process is really stuck, not to mention suffering Syria. Immigration crisis will come back with a new force, with no clear mandate for Brussels and dubious intentions of Turkey. Politicians all over Europe are wary of important elections that are coming up in Germany and France. Societies of Europe are tired, are angry. The EU is not popular and is often used as a scapegoat. To make a long story short, the Slovak presidency brings the EU to a threshold of a new European reality. We know there will be no business as usual. The EU will change, has to change. And Brussels is belatedly waking up to this challenge. Europe's future is not necessarily ever closer union. Everything is kind of reversible. Schengen, euro currency, single market. And it seems to me that multi-speed Europe is probably the reality of the future, whether we want it or not. On the other hand, the EU is still half-baked project in many areas. We have monetary union without economic union. Eurozone integration is still work in progress, as the ECFIN ministers surely know. That brings me to the last point, most crucial, most important point. Europe, in my mind, faces a dilemma. To prevent crisis, it needs more centralization that Eurosceptics hate. This is why, somewhat paradoxically, grand ideas come back now. There is a talk of European army. Some other people talk about Europe-wide intelligence agency. Others talk of continental partnership between the EU members and countries like the UK, maybe Turkey, maybe Ukraine. Others talk about new social Europe emerging. Let me repeat once again. To see off the next crisis, the train of integration will have to keep moving probably, but ever more voters are standing in front of a locomotive yelling, stop! So I am puzzled, I am confused, so are many people these days, and in hard times like this, we resort to wise men who are able to advise us where to go. Mario Monti is an Italian economist, politician, former prime minister, commissioner. Mr. Monti, you investigated controversial mergers of big companies. You made sure abusing of dominant position on the single market is severely punished. This is how you became Super Mario. We still remember your report about the future of single market from 2011, and we remember how you became, in hard times, the Prime Minister of Italy, of technocratic government, which is, I guess, a rare species in a country like Italy. You are also a founding member of a Spinelli group, and recently you have been involved in the restructuring of the EU budget. Please come to the stage, Mr. Prime Minister. We need your words of wisdom.
Thank you very much for that very modest and minimalistic words of introduction, which make my task here even simpler. I'm really delighted to be with you today and to discuss issues of indeed common interest and acute urgency, I believe. My reflection will be on a very, very simple topic which ties many other topics, and we could call it the future of economic policies in the EU, which is also the topic that finance ministers addressed over lunch here at the informal ECOFIN Council in Bratislava, and where Minister Borg and I had the pleasure of being invited to address the ministers. I believe that the recent huge challenges make it clear, at least to me, that the economic policy framework for the EU can no longer be sought through improvements at the margin. At the same time, I do not believe that a revolution is needed in the policy framework of the EU. But we must, in my view, revisit the foundations of our framework, identify and address some deep divisions that have emerged between the visions, the political cultures of the different parts of Europe. So far, in spite of these divisions, and I will mention some of them, the official Europe, which I do not blame at all, I've been part of it, has made progress through large doses of constructive ambiguity. But constructive ambiguity has reached its limits. If there is no common vision, after all, policy compromises may be reached but are no longer credible to citizens and to the markets. Because citizens and markets see through the language of compromises reached at 4 o'clock in the morning the appearance and the ephemeral solidity of a presumed agreement, but are ready to see, sometimes rightly, other times wrongly, the dismantling of the common will that is meant to be expressed by those statements. In particular, I believe, and I would like very much to discuss with you if this comes up, and in particular with my colleagues here on the podium, and I should have to begin with thanked Minister Udak for his welcome, and I am aware that we are, and I personally am during these days, using up the Minister's time in an unacceptable way, because for the last 2 days he was in Brussels at the European Parliament co-chairing with the President of the Parliament and the Vice President of the Commission a very interesting, I thought, inter-parliamentary conference on the work I'm doing with a group set up by the Commission, Council and Parliament on the future of the EU budget, about which I will say a word at the end. So, in my view, there are 3 main tensions which undermine the solidity of any agreement, its credibility, and above all, the willingness to move forward. I see one tension between the integration, in particular the market integration in Europe, and the social/national backlashes against it. The second tension is the tension about the rules and discretion/flexibility. The Stability and Growth Pact and its implementation is a very good example of that. And the third tension is an emerging need for European public goods in the areas of internal and external securities, policy on migrants and refugees, and many other areas. Emerging need for European public goods and a EU budget that may or may not, from the quantitative point of view, be fit for the purpose, but which is certainly unfit for the purpose as regards the structure of the expenditures, the ways of financing it, and the budget process itself, because it leaves a lot to be desired in terms of transparency, readability, fairness. Often the countries which are less well off in terms of income end up paying a higher proportion of their income in terms of national contributions to the EU than the richer countries. These three unresolved tensions are translating themselves more and more in tensions between cultures and countries, and they are feeding mistrust, sometimes acrimony. So, as we have to confront the challenge for the first time since immemorable times, the word disintegration has become of great current use, the challenges of actual or potential disintegration. We also have to face the risk of many other forms of disintegration, either between North and South in terms of vision of the economy, of the relationship between rules and flexible understanding, between the Anglo-Saxon view of the economic process and macroeconomy and the more Hayekian Ordo Liberalismus principle of Germany, and yet other growing gaps. By the way, the ministers have been discussing also, and in particular, the relationship between the ins and the outs relative to the euro. As you might have thought already, none of these three challenges has to do specifically with the members and non-members of the Eurozone. They all pertain to a Europe of 28 or 27 member states, even though, of course, some of the consequences that not addressing successfully these tensions may have may be more serious for the members of the Eurozone than not. In my view, and I will try to sketch out what could be the contents of it, this calls not so much, as I said, for perfectionism at the margin. For sure, the report of the 5 presidents on how to improve the governance of EMU is a good thing, but I do not believe that solving those aspects, however very important, will really make for what I believe should be a shared commitment to sustain European integration and growth. Because Europe is at risk of disintegration, because we have always believed that integration, take the single market, is itself a huge vector of potential growth. We need to see more and more, in my view, of each policy, be it the EU budget or macroeconomic policy or any other EU policy, what will it do to the integration or disintegration among European countries and among mindsets of the different cultures. The first tension, the one between more integration, in particular more market integration, and backlashes. We know how fundamental the construction of the single market and the accession to the single market of new members has been for the whole process of the European construction. And also how it has been a transformational factor for the behavior of companies, of institutions, of individuals on many occasions. I believe that the single market will never reach the stage of completion, as each important European summit proclaims it will. Well, not only because new sectors emerge who would have spoken 20 years ago of the digital single market, but also because a number of backlashes, a number of obstacles against integration exist or are created by the evolution of society and sometimes by EU policies. In 2010, I had the privilege of being asked by President Barroso to, yes, that was kindly mentioned earlier, to present a report on the future of the single market, which brought me to visit most member states, and I saw, and I made a sort of a classification of the relationship between each culture, each country, and the single market. And what not unexpectedly came up is that we all belong, and the Lisbon Treaty proclaims that we all belong to a continent which wants to achieve a highly competitive social market economy. Yet there are more countries which are more intimately related to the market size of this side of these constructions, and others which are more linked to the social elements. Because of the crisis, but also because of a remaining gap in the mentalities, there isn't really an agreement on what to do. In particular, we have built over the years a single market which is far from being complete. Just think of the backward stage of implementation of the single market for services or for the digital. And yet, already at the partial state of completion in which it finds itself, it creates a huge amount of backlashes from all quarters, from the corporate community, which may not wish to see the openness in the market for corporate control, therefore foreign companies coming in and buy the control of domestic companies, and often invoking the protective intervention of the state to avoid that. Or the French citizens in 2005, terrified by the appearance of millions of Polish plumbers in each small village in France. And with the difficulties of the economic crisis, these resistances to the full implementation of the single market have multiplied. And I believe that not enough attention has been given to this. In that report, I made a number of proposals. Many of them had been already around for some time, and the Commission, at the initiative of Commissioner Barnier and President Barroso, put many of them in act. But they didn't take up what, to me, was the most important part of the report, namely the challenge of trying to find a new deal, a new understanding between the most liberal countries, like at the time was the UK, or many of the Nordic countries in Europe, and at the time were the new member states, and the more social countries like France in the first place, but also Germany at the level of the Länder at least, not necessarily at the federal level, etc. And the deal should have consisted in what? We, more social-oriented countries, undertake to be more forthcoming in accepting the construction of, for example, the single market for services, but in exchange you more liberal countries accept to make some progress with us on the issue of tax coordination, so that, being very, very attentive not to undermine the competitiveness of Europe, etc., some aspects which concern the most mobile tax bases, be it capital, be it the location of companies, be it the structures for the multinationals to minimize the tax impact on their operations, be more coordinated. In fact, we have now seen, even in the UK, that the unrest about the very uneven distribution of the benefits from globalization, of which European integration is a component, has generated precisely a backlash against the single market. They have psychologically, collectively decided that they don't want any more free movement of people. You will know that in 2002, 2003, the UK with Sweden and Ireland were the three only countries which thought that it was not necessary to put transitory periods to free movement from the new member states. You see the dramatic, rapid change. And in the case of the UK, they have even decided to leave, not just the single market, but the European Union. So I believe that a new case should now be made, and the evidence is there, maybe it was not there 7 years ago, about the fact that some moderate coordination of taxation at least will avoid that what was meant to be a vector for progress, the single market, is seen by many in societies as a vector of maldistribution of income and of greater social tensions that brings them to ask their governments to be very protectionist on the single market. Concerning this first tension and possible indication on how to resolve it, I should mention that Brexit will have an implication here, because we know of the willingness by the UK to remain as much as possible in the single market, even though not in the EU. That is understandable. I have always been a fervent admirer, culturally and more generally, of the UK, and I believe that they have brought to European integration even more than they believe. Not just they, but in particular the very conservative party through Margaret Thatcher and Lord Caulfield, which were behind the drive to put in place the single market. Yet, I think it would be a profoundly misled benevolence that of the EU if it were to come to the conclusion that it is reasonable to offer to the UK a better than Norwegian participation to the single market. And we have seen some recent papers pleading in that direction. Having been in charge of the single market and competition policy, so two eminently British constructions in the EU, I would strongly warn about doing that. And also we have seen in the aftermath of the Apple case that instinctively already, but loudly, the UK has been telling the world of the multinationals, come to us, we will no longer be members of the European Union, unlike Ireland. We will not be subject to the rules of competition and state aid control, and yet implicitly the message is, but of course we will continue to be part of the European single market, so we will be the best of two worlds. That is very nice in principle. I believe the EU should not be punitive vis-à-vis the UK but hopefully should not commit suicide, as doing that would mean, because we would undermine the very construction on which Europe rests as an integrated thing, and we would also provide a powerful incentive to some of the current member states to either follow the route of the UK and leave, because life out there is better than in here. Or maybe to member states which want to remain to come up with their own agenda. For example, France has never been enthusiastic of German or Italian or other companies come in and buy the control of their big important companies. I'm sure they would ask to be exempt from that contestability in the market the day that the UK got an ad hoc treatment in the single market. So let's be careful, because politeness may mean dilution, and dilution to an extent that dissolves the EU altogether. The second, and I will be quicker on the second and the third tensions, the second is about rules and discretion. I am in favor of rather stringent rules of fiscal discipline. I've always believed that before then being economic policy rules, these are ethical rules imposing current politicians everywhere to be respectful of future generations. Yet I believe that the Stability and Growth Pact is a dead thing by now, because it has lost all credibility. Daniel Gross recently wrote a paper entitled "The Second Death of the Stability and Growth Pact," and the intent, the laudable intent of the Commission in being a more political Commission to exercise wisdom, discretion and flexibility has led to a number of very generous endorsements of current fiscal policies in France, in Spain, in Portugal, that puzzle the others who still believe in the rules and in the virtues of fiscal policy, of fiscal discipline. I should be as excited as we are all in Italy after a win in a football game, when the news comes that Italy got 3 billion euro more in terms of flexibility from the Commission. The spirit with which Italians read that news is that, first of all, we won. Secondly, we get 3 billions from bloody Brussels, and nobody realizes that not even a euro is coming from Brussels, but it is simply a stamp authorizing the Italian state to have a deficit which would be 3 billion higher than it would have been otherwise authorized. Now, are deficits necessarily bad? No, I do not believe so. I believe that it is a very intricate matter, but basically to judge on whether a debt which is also an increment to the stock of a deficit which is also an increment to the stock of debt is justified or not economically after a correction is made for the cycle, etc., is to see whether that finances genuine new public investment, and there are genuine public investments. So I believe that more flexibility is something that drifts governments to use, as it was before the Stability Pact, to use current resources for transfer purposes, public consumption, putting the burden on the shoulder of future generations. I do not believe this is a healthy thing. I mentioned the example of Italy, but Italy is relatively virtuous now. The other countries I mentioned have not come out of the excessive deficit procedure as Italy has in the spring of 2013. And on the other hand, I believe that there must be great disillusionment in those parts of Europe who believe that the rules are there to be respected. But they, in turn, should wonder whether there is not also a certain responsibility. Perhaps the rules are not so respected because they are not entirely respectable, not in terms of feasibility, but in terms of economic logic. And it has always been clear, at least to me, but not to everybody, that what Germany had in its initial constitution and was changed relatively few years ago, namely that yes, the government can indebt itself, but only to have public investment done, is a sensible rule. So I believe that it would be rather urgent to end this slightly ludicrous game of believing that something important is being enforced, whereas it is not enforced, and many believe it is no longer important, whereas I think it should remain important. So something that would introduce, not through the little window of flexibility as if it were a venial sin, but directly in the rule, because, and there are ways to make sure that one does not place for investment something that is bluntly public consumption, would be a progress in the quality of the rule. And then, other than for really exceptional circumstances, I do not believe that there would be justifications for flexibility. Finally, the third tension is concerning the budget. And I think we can express it in this way. The last year has been very eloquent in terms of showing how badly needed are some goods, in a broad sense, that are very relevant for the welfare of our citizens throughout Europe, because they have to do with the sense of insecurity, internal, external, etc. For migrations and all that, an effective control of the external frontier, and yet member states alone cannot provide this, and they are the first ones inverting a well-established historical pattern of many decades now to invoke Brussels to take on these new functions. So I believe the whole budget should be reconsidered, in a sense, by having the EU, as businessmen say, focus on the core business. And one should review how many of the current programs which have responded to initial political incentives of this or that member state, or this or that part in the European Parliament, could easily be scrapped, not easily, but should be scrapped, or else devolved back to the member states. On the other hand, there are new things having to do with the role of Europe in globalization and having to do with internal and external security, climate change, etc., that require classically a production by the EU, which would have to mean the capacity to produce them, which is not obvious, needs to be built up, but also the financing for that. So that when in December the group that met under the auspices of Minister Hudak in the Parliament yesterday in Brussels will produce its final report, we will have a number of broad scenarios and a number of specific perceptions, and there will be a lot to do in a topic that is extremely sensitive, also because unanimity reigns there. My final observation is through these, and there too Brexit has to be taken into account. I believe Brexit is a very terrible thing on which we should all reflect a lot, which we should not make even more terrible for Europe by not taking note of some indirectly positive consequences that Brexit may bring with it. I mentioned the fact that now, maybe with the UK out, when it will be out, the resistance to more tax coordination will be diminished. And here, in budgetary matters, since 1984, since Margaret Thatcher, the British rebate has been a very awkward generator of other rebates or counter rebates, so that when it comes to the budget, there are the friends of agriculture, the friends of cohesion, the friends of rebates. As Minister Hudak heard me say yesterday, our proposals for reform, facilitated perhaps by the fact that the mother of all rebates will no longer be there, is to build just one constituency in budgetary matters, that is the Friends of European Citizens. For all these things, ladies and gentlemen, which may appear to be deep, far-reaching, perhaps to be considered for the next decades, I believe there is huge urgency to have a discussion and to do something. And I believe that as citizens, we can no longer consider it natural that if in one or two important countries there are, for example, elections in 2017, then nothing serious can be done before 2017. This is exactly the use or the subordination of Europe to the constraints of domestic politics, which has recently had the most visible example in a British Prime Minister calling for a referendum to serve not the EU interest, not the British interest, not the interest of his party, but the interest of his continued leadership in that party. Now, we should all draw lessons from that, I believe, and if it is France and Germany who have elections in 2017, isn't that rather irrelevant relative to the fact that some things are urgent in order to put Europe on a less disintegrating path? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. I think that these subjects will come in the debate, and now I would like to make a small introduction of the rest of the speakers and invite them to the stage here with the Prime Minister. Mr. Anders Borg, in the early 90s I heard a nasty joke about the Swedish welfare state. It went like this: that the Swedish welfare state is like a Volvo without cars. Maybe a nice thing, but it does not work. And thanks to people like Mr. Borg, it's not true, and actually it's outrageous, because with your role as a finance minister, actually for several years, it was 8 years, you were able to prove that generous welfare state can function also as a competitive economy, and it's really, really important. You are an economist, politician, you have advised the Finnish government as well, you have advised the board of Swedish National Bank, and one thing to point out, as a Minister of Finance, you also were aware how important the labor market is, how to make people go from welfare into work. Please come to the stage, Mr. Minister, and let me introduce another speaker. Jan Rostowski. former finance minister of Poland for several years, from 2007 to 2013, but also deputy prime minister. And back then, when all hell broke loose in the early 90s, you were advisor to Mr. Leszek Barcelowicz, and you were one of the authors of the success of shock therapy, thanks to which Poland today is a prospering economy. You also were economic advisor to the National Bank of Poland and Bank PKO SA. You are a member of a civic platform party, and you were named the European Minister of the Year back in 2009 by the Banker magazine. Please come to the stage, Mr. Minister. Last but not least, Mr. Vasil Hudak, government plenipotentiary for negotiations of the EU budget. Preferably, personally, I like the position Mr. Budget very well, because it appeals to the imagination. You have been a Minister of Economy of the Slovak Republic from 2015 to 2016. Before that, you were State Secretary at the Ministry of Finance of the country. And you are also former Vice President of the City Group in Prague and Executive Director for Governmental Relations with CEE countries at JP Morgan Chase Bank. Please come to the stage, Vasil. And I will join you. And I don't want to waste time by my speaking, and probably every speaker has a right for some kind of initial statement. I would just add one little question, which is about upcoming Bratislava summit. What do you think about it? Are you hopeful, or you devoid of illusions? What would be your guess that the decisions are made there? Please let us start with Minister Borg.
Thank you very much. I will give 3 reflections, and basically all of them will be kind of warnings for the leaders in the Bratislava European Council meeting. I think we should realize that Europe is in a deep and fundamental economic crisis. The growth of the last 10 years has been 0.5, productivity for the last 10 years on average has been 0.5, unemployment is at 11%, employment rates are at 65%, and actually at around 50% for people above 55 years. So, and on top of that, we have a public debt that is now about 90%. Just to get the perspectives right, if we can only print 0.5 productivity growth, that will only allow wages to increase 5% in a 10-year perspective and only 10% in a 20-year perspective. So if we want to deliver real wages and living standards to the people, we have to do reforms. And my first message is that the most important thing for Europe is to do structural reforms. And that is not about building an ever closer union or a closer cooperation between the Euro countries or moving towards a fiscal union. All of the structural issues are actually about policies that are outside a fiscal union. If you look at labour market policies, active labour market measures, unemployment benefit, taxes, education system, any of these areas that are key to reduce unemployment are on the member state level. It's structural reforms that you need to do to make your own labour market more flexible. When it comes to productivity, some of the reforms are on the EU level, like trade, single market, single digital market, and many other measures that can be implemented, but they are not in terms of a fiscal union. Many of the issues that you could do in terms of improving the entrepreneurial climate, to move forward in terms of digitalization and to strengthen your investment climate, are basically policies for the member states. They are not a part of an overall European policy. So I would argue that if you want to improve growth, you have to do the reforms in the member states, and there is no substitute to structural reforms. And I would warn of building an ever closer Eurogroup union. I would argue that it's not even the best way if you want to vitalize fiscal policy in Europe. If you look at the US, it is a fiscal union, and they have not outperformed Europe in terms of growth productivity. If you look at the real wages, it's actually clear that normal people in the US have not seen any increases over the last 10 years. and they have a debt level that is actually higher than in Europe. And if you compare the growth numbers, you can actually note that the US have underperformed in terms of labor market volatility in comparison to Europe. So if there is anything that we want to achieve that is similar to the US, it's the dynamic business climate and the flexible labor market. It's not the fiscal union. I would argue, as a person working in a country that is outside the Eurozone, that to me the European Union is more important than the Eurozone, because it represents broader values. We have security challenges in the East and also from the Middle East, and therefore the European Union is extremely important. I've spent hours to think on how you could construct a procedure or a voting rule or a process that would prevent an even closer European Eurozone cooperation not to break up the European Union, and I can't find any such rule. I can't find a solution to that problem. To me, it's more important to vitalize fiscal policy on the member state level. The Nordic countries have been twice as efficient as the US and 3 times as efficient as Germany in stabilizing the business cycle according to the IMF. And that is basically because we have a low debt level, we have a very stringent budget process, and we have flexible economies. So I'm not arguing that Germany cannot do more in terms of stimulating demand. Demand is a very, very important part of our equation. But I think that those policies should be implemented in the member states level and not through the Eurozone group. So, to my mind, it's important that we focus on the really important issues to strengthen growth in the European Union. That has to come from structural reforms. Those reforms we can only build if we also take into account social cohesion and try to build an inclusive growth model. But this is the key. If we are going to counter populism, we have to deliver real wage growth and jobs. Real wage growth and jobs comes out of structural reforms. And there is no alternative to do the right thing, and that is to start work on structural reforms.
Well, thank you. There's a lot in what Anders said that I agree with, and there's quite a lot I disagree with, and I'll come on to that as well. But I just wanted to go back a little bit because Jakub Wiśniewski was kind enough to say that I took part in the shock therapy of the 1990s, which of course was the greatest single structural reform ever. And so I don't feel I particularly need to take lessons in structural reform from anybody. Not that you were particularly looking at me, I think.
I was definitely not directly.
I think you weren't. But what I did want to say, as a counterpoint to that, was that although, having done the structural reforms in the early 1990s, it's also worth noting that from 2008, Poland had the highest economic growth of any EU country, of any OECD country, and of any European country. And in fact, number 2 was Malta, and if we may leave Malta aside for the moment, number 3 was Slovakia, and our cumulative growth was twice as high as Slovakia's. And I would say, if I had to coin a phrase for the policy in that period, far from being shock therapy, it was soothing therapy. Right? Essentially, not only did we achieve this extraordinary growth rate, but we also achieved extremely high increases in per capita income for the middle 60% of the population, the 3 middle quintiles, something like 30% in real terms. And we also shifted from being second to last as far as our unemployment level was concerned to being, I think, in other words, 26th, to being 14th in a matter of 6 or 7 years in the EU. So there were very strong elements of cohesion, very strong elements of successful labour market policy, all right? And basically, the way I believe we did it was by pursuing what we thought was the right fiscal policies at the time. So when we felt we should allow the deficits to rise, we allowed them to rise. And when we needed to trick the Commission into not understanding what we were doing, we did that. And when we had to threaten them and bully them in order to get them off our backs, we did that as well. Now, I can't help drawing the conclusion, and this is our fundamental disagreement, that we actually in Europe do need a fiscal instrument. We need to obviously walk on two legs. There are lots of countries that need serious structural reform. But we also need the other instrument. We need the possibility of a pan-Eurozone fiscal policy, which doesn't mean it has to be at the level of the Eurozone, but it has to make sense for the Eurozone as a whole. In other words, there has to be someone who can tell the Germans that when their debt is actually bringing them something like 0.5% on 10-year bonds, rather than costing them, they've actually got to run a deficit of 3% or 4% or even 5% of GDP, right? If we can't do that, I know it's not going to happen, but I think there's nothing wrong with saying what is needed, if only in order to see the challenge that we're facing. And I'm deeply convinced it's not an accident that today we have this feeling that monetary policy is no longer effective. Of course, it started working far too late, started being used in 2012 after the great shock of 2011, where we really were on the edge of disintegration, was allowed to happen, all right? And that's something that people don't forget. But the fact remains, we now have a monetary policy that at least can be more or less relied on to prevent the Eurozone from falling apart, right? Which it did in 2012, thank God. But now for active and successful demand stimulation, which we don't need at the moment, by the way, at this moment, although the latest July German figures may suggest that we will in a year or two, or maybe even at the beginning of next year. We don't need it at the moment, I'm not claiming that. But there have been situations where we needed it, last year, year before last, and we didn't have that instrument. And the reason is simple. Transmission of monetary policy from the central bank to the economy goes through a whole host of different channels, we all know that. And those channels depend on the structure of the financial sector, on the demand of different non-financial businesses and so on and so forth. And sometimes those channels, for complicated reasons that have been described by I don't know how many economists, one channel after the other will get blocked. And monetary policy then fails to stimulate the economy. The only channel for monetary policy that always works to stimulate the economy is a fiscal deficit, financed by the central bank. That always works because, I mean, unless the money's spent on something totally absurd, but even if it's not spent on deficits, right, the money gets through into purchasing power. And we need that kind of instrument if we're to have a Eurozone that is properly armed with economic instruments. Now, the basic and of course I wouldn't suggest for a moment that it should be therefore Greece should be allowed to have large deficits, all right, or even necessarily Italy. Germany should be obliged to. Now, of course, we know how, just saying it tells us how difficult it is to achieve that. But it also points to something more fundamental. It points to a fundamental lack of trust between the nations of the Eurozone. And of course we know how enormously dangerous that is. I should be teaching at the university at which my colleague will be teaching next year, and I'm preparing stuff on the Great Depression. And the great problem, and lack of trust, was one of the fundamental sources of the Great Depression. This was actually lack of trust between districts of the Federal Reserve. The Chicago Fed would not lend money to the New York Fed, right? These kind of things can be absolutely catastrophic. And just to finish up on many of the things, and I won't go back over the things that Mario said, many of which I agree, but with this kind of a ship, we're on a sea where there's the danger of massive political shocks, which can translate into massive economic shocks. It's enough to imagine the possible result of the November the 8th US elections to realize that we can have a political shock that will have not only massive political ramifications, but also massive economic ramifications. And in that situation, we really need every instrument that we can possibly have in case we need it, right? And to finish about the different kinds of conflicts, I mean, the problem is that when we lose our direction, different groups are not only in conflict, but they're also looking for different things. For instance, you talked about the tension between the East and the West. For two of the countries, Hungary and Poland, I think the tension is actually about not having to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria, the most fundamental criteria of EU membership, in other words, on democracy and the rule of law. So we have a series of sort of intersecting conflicts where the British are talking about one thing and want to leave for that reason and maybe have a partnership. The Hungarians and the Poles would like jackal-like in the the Poles weren't jackal in the 1930s, but others maybe were, want to take advantage of this to extract, to renegotiate certain fundamental aspects of the EU settlement. I shan't talk about Brexit except to say I'm not actually sure that the British really think. I'm very interested that you said that they do think that they will really be trying to get special access to the single market. I have an uncomfortable intuition that actually there's a sort of almost revolutionary dynamic that has developed in England. I don't mean on the streets, but among politicians, where he who is more hard Brexit is purer. And there are enemies of the people in the civil service, all sorts of strange places, who want to prevent Brexit from being true Brexit. And only true Brexit can make the people truly happy. So if that recalls certain themes where we are, among, of course, many other countries in the region, I can't help it. I think at the very top, of course, Hammond and May are thinking your way, but they're under, I think, enormous pressure from the other people. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I think Mario already had a very long speech. He needs to have a rest. But I would go back actually to the original question that was put by Jakub, because that's very interesting. What can we expect and what can we achieve at the Bratislava summit, which is supposed to be on September 16th, and there are many questions about that. Very difficult question, because it's actually for the first time when 27 leaders, not 28, but 27 will meet together. I think the idea of bringing together those leaders, except for UK, is the right one, because after Brexit, I think people in 27 countries are asking what is the response. So, okay, there is some vote which happened in UK, which indicates that there is some level of disappointment in the EU, and now, so what? And I'm puzzled what actually will come out of this. Of course, Bratislava meeting is a first in a series, as far as I understand. There will be a similar summit during the Malta presidency, probably in February. Then in March in Rome there will be a major gathering of the EU leaders because of the 60th anniversary of the Rome treaties, which is the basis. So it's a process. But for me the key question is whether current European leaders can come up with the vision that is needed and expected from them. Because I think people would expect that even at the Bratislava, at the end of the Bratislava summit, there will be some declaration or at least some indication that, okay, Brexit happened, that's why we have to rethink what we are doing and how we are doing in the EU, and here are some elements of the new vision. And that's where I'm not sure. I'm not sure that there is a political leadership in the current Europe that is able to do that. Of course, all this is also aggravated by the fact that we have, as was already mentioned by Mario and others, we have some important elections coming up in Germany, in Netherlands, even in Italy, in terms of referendum, in France. All these hampers the ability of leaders to be bold. And I'm just afraid that if we again go into an exercise which is not going to bring new vision, new bold ideas, but it will be kind of typical European muddling through. You know, just, okay, another declaration, another statement, but nothing really serious, nothing that people will believe is really a new way how we are going to deal with the issues that we do have, challenges that we do have in the EU. Then this disappointment, the ability which basically gives rise to the populism and to extremists is going to continue. So we will see, but I think it's going to be quite a big test for European politics.
Thank you very much, Vasil. This is a very honest and realistic statement, and I would like to push you a little bit more, and maybe other speakers will want to jump in. If we were to identify 2, 3 topics, themes, areas of integration where we could have a quick success in terms of single market, functioning of the EU, so to change the logic. I know that this subject was actually raised a little bit by Prime Minister Monti. If I understood you correctly, Mr. Prime Minister, you said that we need to bring back the common man, bring back the European integration to common man, which means not only some abstract economic policies, but also things that people can touch and feel as the direct benefits of a European integration. Actually, Chancellor Angela Merkel recently said something like this, that the EU only will prosper when it is delivering real results to the European citizens. I know that the single market has brought many good things, but somehow people do not take it into account when they go to vote, when they listen to politicians from just sometimes strange parties putting the EU as a scapegoat, as a guilty institution of any problems. So I go back to this question. Maybe some 2, 3 areas where we could have a low-hanging fruit to pick.
Is that to me?
I would start with Vasil and go to the Prime Minister if possible.
Tough question, because Europe, as we know, is really a mosaic where things are intertwined, and it's very difficult to say that this is the low-hanging fruit and we just take this and suddenly things will happen. But maybe I would focus on, because, and again, I think we have to be, and politicians need to be attuned to what is important for people. And the politics are not made for politicians and for politics themselves, but they have to serve people, and especially in today's times, when we see the rise of populism and we see the rise of extremism, we have to come up with policies which also respond to these concerns that people have. So I would focus on 2 areas. One is migration. I think migration is an issue which is a European issue, that European citizens see, perceive, they're uncertain about this. Of course, they are interpreted in different parts of Europe differently, and we are here in the part of Europe which has a specific approach to this. But I think if European leaders were able to come up with some joint approach, And again, it could be in terms of the guidelines, in terms of strategy, in terms of focusing on 3 pillars. How do we better bring the migrants to the society, the integration of migrants on one hand, secondly on protecting our borders, and thirdly on helping to develop the neighboring areas from where the migrants are coming. So if there was some common strategy and not just kind of accusing each other across borders and between new and old member states and east and west, but something common which would be clear, simple, and kind of easy to communicate to people, I think this would be one important issue. And the second one is the investment. I think everybody's concerned about the economy, everybody's concerned about the ability of Europe to be competitive in the global economy. And here I think we need to have much stronger pro-investment policy, which I think should include, as Professor Rostovsky mentioned, also deficit financing. It should include much better coordination of policies, for example, with the Eurostat. Just a small issue, but this can hamper you a lot if Eurostat creates rules which basically do not allow you to use public money for investment. And there could be a set of rules which can really unwind in pro-investment push in Europe and kind of re-energize Europe from the economic point of view. So I'll focus on those two.
Thank you. Mr. Monti, please.
I think the Bratislava summit of the heads of governments is both inevitable and ironic. Because it is inevitable because, of course, it is the highest level political entity, so it should take a view and tell Europe what it is going to do. Yet it is ironic because most of the problematic aspects of Europe that they will sit down to consider have been largely caused by them. And Brexit, for example, has been largely caused by one of them who will not be sitting there any longer. But he only did, to the extreme degree, something that all the others, more or less in recent years, have been indulging into, that is to use the EU no longer as an investment for the future, but as something that can be squeezed, distorted, and from which one wants to extract as much support as possible for domestic consensus. More than anything else, I would like to see, I'm not sure it will come, a very sober assumption of collective responsibility. Because I think this is the fundamental point. We will not have, other than lip service to Europe, until some of them will not say so, but will be ready to lose an election in the interest of Europe, as Kohl did in order to introduce the single currency. Schroeder did not want it at the time. So I think also us, the public opinion, should impress the idea that we are so much on the brink of the end of integration in all senses that it will not be possible to save Europe unless we are ready to pay some price for that. The worst possible outcome of the Bratislava summit would be, on the other hand, some sort of either explicit or implicit, through them talking to the press, finger pointing on the EU institutions. I believe that those who are working full-time on Europe, the European Parliament, the Commission, the ECB, may be doing their job a bit better, a bit worse, but they cannot be seen as the main responsible of what is going on in Europe, and may still worsen. In terms of things to be done immediately, I am very skeptical of any goodie to be delivered instantly for the sake of the promotion of Europe in the eyes of citizens. But, for example, declaring that within a number of months an appropriate way of treating investment also at the national level will be introduced, which, by the way, goes in the direction of less Europe, not more Europe, because if investment in Europe has to rely essentially on the Juncker plan, that is a European instrument. If Europe keeps the control of the definition, maybe very, very restrictive, of what is a qualifiable investment at the national level, then allows a good treatment of that in the Stability Pact. That is, I think, a healthy policy of encouraging investment through subsidiarity. But I don't have the slightest idea. Certainly they meet in the most beautiful place they could, and with the very healthy modesty of having a key figure who has been responsible, is responsible for the Slovakian presidency, can I say so, who tells us openly, I don't know what will come out, and I think you share all the concerns of the normal citizen as the rest of us are.
Would you like to jump in?
Well, I don't see low-hanging fruit, except, of course, that I really have to say this because I've been thinking about it whilst Mario was talking about what Anders had said earlier, and it's after having sat side by side and fought shoulder to shoulder, I think, on so many things. I've thought over this, and I really do have to say that I disagree with him really fundamentally. I really don't think that fiscal, that in the modern world for developed countries, fiscal deficits and public debt are a problem. I mean, when interest rates are negative, they just really aren't. And on top of that, there's a very specific situation, because of course in the long run they are, right? In the long run it's true that they will be. But we are where we are in the particular moment where we are. We are in a situation of extreme political tension within Europe. From Russia, through Poland and Hungary, to Britain, possibly France, and all the way out to the United States. And really, if things break badly in a few of these places at the same time, and that can happen over a short period of time, then the political dynamic, and I don't just mean populist parties getting elected, I'm talking about people taking substantive decisions that will be directed against their neighbours and their partners, right, when these sort of things happen. It's obviously the greatest risk is Trump, and you know, it's very 0-1, and if it doesn't happen, you know, we're that much safer, and I'm that much closer to Anders, right? But if it does happen, we really are in a completely different political and therefore economic world, and therefore we have to sort of prioritize where the risks are. And really, long-term growth of productivity is not the issue if Trump gets elected, right? Keeping the union together and preventing really serious political conflicts with countries outside the union, between the member states of the union, is really the issue. And we have to pursue what the French beautifully call apaisement, which was misunderstood as appeasement, which means a policy of calming, right? And if you have to borrow against the future to save the present, I'm in favor of that.
I must say that Jacek is one of my best friends. We served, I think, 5 years together, or 6 years together in the council, and we often work as a tag team during the negotiations. But I must admit that on this point we disagree. We don't disagree over fiscal policy. Fiscal policy has to be a part of the toolbox. It's pretty clear that in an environment with very low growth, you need to use fiscal policy to stimulate demand, and demand has to be part of the equation. Where we disagree is whether this should be delegated to technocrats in Brussels or whether this should be done on the member state level, and whether we should focus on strengthening the budget processes in all the countries to make them more efficient in terms of stabilizing demand. The fact that the Nordic countries have been able to do this is not because we have sat on our hands, it's because we use the quality tools. But we've done it more efficiently than, for example, Germany. That's why we've been 3 times more efficient than Germany in terms of stabilization policy. If you delegate VAT levels, or you delegate transfers, I would assume that everybody would be happy when you reduce the VAT level from the Brussels decision. The day you raise VAT levels with 1 or 2% in a country, that would be cause an uproar. If you permanently institute transfer payments from the north to the south, because that is what this will basically be about, well, that will create a lot of tensions. We don't need more decisions made by technocratic elites. We need more accountability for people taking decisions. And to create further conflicts this way, I think would fuel populism in terms of alternative for Germany or Le Pen in France. So to my mind, countering populism is about real wages and jobs, not Brussels structures. And therefore productivity is the key to the whole issue. Here I fundamentally disagree with Jacek. The reason why we are in this predicament is that productivity has slowed down, and we cannot deliver real wage growth anymore in the long term to people. With 0.5 in productivity growth, we will deliver 5% wage increases over the next decade. People will not notice that they have received more money in their wallet, and we fundamentally need to get productivity up, and that cannot be done without structural reforms. So if I would then go to your issue, I would argue that there are 3 areas where I would think that the leaders should concentrate. The first is the banking union. The rules are misconstructed. It's very difficult to deal with bank restructuring under the current regime of no bailout. I think the states should be able to put money into banks and restore their balance sheets. They should do it with haircuts, and I've cut off my ponytail, so I know a little bit about haircuts and market valuation of the assets. So it should be done conservatively and stringently, but unless we rapidly restore our banking sector, monetary policy will not be efficient in Europe. So they have to rethink the banking union. They have to let the Italians and others really do what is necessary with the banking sector. Second issue is pretty obvious: security. Europe needs to strengthen its presence in terms of security. We all know that this is basically about Germany and some other countries spending much less than they are required through the NATO commitments on security. That has to be changed. We need to step up European security when our close neighborhood has become more difficult. Thirdly, migration. We need to deal with migration issues. And again, I must admit that to my mind this is basically about labor market and structural reforms. We need to reduce the thresholds into our labor markets. We need to have more flexible labor market. We need to have more jobs that are in line with people's qualifications. And if I look at Sweden, that has received an enormous amount of immigrants over the last couple of years, it's eminently important for us to make our labor market more flexible. Otherwise, we will not be able to get these people onto the labor market. And there's nothing about Brussels here in terms of what we need to do in Sweden. We need to reform our labor market. That has to be done in Sweden. otherwise, we have received 400,000 people, which is equal to 4% of our labor force. And if you want to integrate that, you have to have a much more flexible labor market. There's no way around that.
We have something like 10 minutes before we finish. Time passes quickly, and I would like to open it up to questions. We have time for one series of questions from the audience. Please, who would like to ask a question?
Milanic from Globsec Policy Institute from here. Two quick questions. To Anders Borg, I'm a fan of your reforms, structural reforms, but they came in a different time. Now we are in Europe of weak governments. So tell me one government in Europe that is your champion now, that is able to implement those long-term structural reforms. And to others, rules are very important. A very controversial decision was on the table a few months or weeks ago on Spain and Portugal and the deficit. What's your comment on that, when the Commission decided not to actually follow the rules that were agreed just at the deepest moments of Eurozone crisis, when you were in power, or in your as finance ministers, sitting behind the table a few years ago?
Let's cover a bit more, if you allow me. Mr. Pavel Demeš.
Thank you. I will have a question to Vasil Hudak and Mr. Rostovsky. Vasil, we are 1 week from Bratislava summit, and I expected in your intro that you will not speak up your frustration, but rather outline some steps which government where you serve has. Because, as I understand, this was Prime Minister Fico's idea to invite leaders of all Europe to stay one day and think through and send signals to citizens which will reassure them that political leadership is knowing what they do. And what you performed, it is that you are outlining already that you are afraid of Bratislava summit, not that government of Robert Fico has some ideas with which he would like to stimulate colleagues which are coming to Bratislava. Would you try at least to outline some steps which we, for 1 week, and analysts, whoever we are in the room, could understand what Bratislava summit is all about? Because from all of your performances, you didn't mention anything about long-hanging fruit, what Jakub asked. Everything is high-hanging fruit, and moreover, there is even fear that you will end up with something which citizens will not understand. It's rather pity if you are articulating it before weekend and week before Bratislava summit. I think that you need to do some rescue operation if you need, and many of us would be happy to help you, because public diplomacy is critical now. Unless you will be able to come up with something understandable for people, I think that you are losing Bratislava summit, and I'm a citizen of this city and would like to understand how I and others can contribute. If I spoke to mayor of this city yesterday and asked him how he is going to contribute to Bratislava summit, he said he doesn't know. I don't know what it is our chairmanship or presidency knew. Our means whose, not ours. I think many of us are saying, and if you want, we can do some emergency thinking what to do with that. And Mr. Rostovsky, you mentioned that, if I understood correctly, that countries like Poland and Hungary may have trouble with Copenhagen criteria. Could you elaborate on that a bit? And how do you assess recent Warsaw meeting of Visegrad prime ministers with Angela Merkel? What it brought from your point of view before Bratislava summit as impulse to think through some of the challenges which we are discussing?
I will give 3 examples of countries that actually do quite a lot of structural reforms. 2 are close to me, so it's simple. The Finns are now implementing reforms that reduce labor cost with some 3.5%, which is quite much. When I advised them, I suggested 5%, but I will not criticize them for doing 3.5%. I think that is very impressive. The Danish government has also started out a reform process heading for the next 20 years, where they are doing fundamental changes of their tax system and reducing regulatory barriers to increase productivity. I also think we're seeing some quite interesting reforms over the last few years being implemented in the Netherlands. So I think there are countries in Europe that try to do more. Obviously it would be even better if it was France and Italy that was making very much progress. They are making progress. I mean, both those governments are really trying to do reforms, and they get some pushback for that. But if we could see them doing something equally substantial as the Finns or the Danes, that would really move the needle. If the Italian or French government could cut labour costs with 3.5–4% and open up their economies, that would really shift the needle for European growth. But I think we are seeing some countries making progress.
Sorry. No, maybe I'll talk. Then you'll be able to answer at the end, and that might be best. I want to go on the low-hanging fruit. Right, the low-hanging fruit, you have to finance it, and of course, I didn't suggest for a moment that there should be transfers. And it's not Anders' fault, because maybe a lot of the other people who say similar things that sound the same are talking about transfers. I'm not talking about transfers. I'm simply saying that when 10-year Italian debt is at less than 1%? A little bit more. Okay. 10-year Italian debt is at a little bit more than 1%. But the rest of the stuff is you know, French is certainly a little bit, it's quite a bit under 1%. This is really a time when there's absolutely no reason not to soak up that 10% unemployment by infrastructure if you want to, right? Of course it would be best if it was the Germans who were doing it. And of course there you have the problem that they don't want to do it, right? And this is the only point where you might need EU, some supranational authority. Otherwise, of course, it should be at the low level. And of course, let me remind everyone, the debt is that low because there's no inflation, right? And there hasn't been and there won't be, right? And these interest rates are going to be at this kind of level for years and years and years, probably because of low productivity growth, and also because of demographic factors, and we should take advantage of that. There's no reason not to when the political threats are so close, so serious. When we, the point is to make the decision to do that, and everyone finds it difficult. I was in Berlin 2 years ago, and I said, you know, you should really be spending money on infrastructure, you know, this is ridiculous. They said, well, we can't find the projects. So I said, well, build 1,000 tanks. It was already after the seizure of Crimea, right? Build 1,000 tanks, build 2,000 tanks. I mean, this is a common European good. And if the Germans don't want to buy the tanks, then they should allow other people who have fewer problems with that, fewer historical problems, to build tanks and finance divisions, right? We have a common need. There's a common public European good for good defense and powerful defense. And it could be Swedish, it could be Polish, we would love to have those tanks, right? It could be Slovak, you have some wonderful mountaineer brigades, right? I mean, for God's sake, the problem is that we've fundamentally got log-jammed and we've run out of ideas. And I have to come to the defense of Vasil. You know, okay, you may be the presidency, but if you're going to be honest, you know that there are 27 or 26 other people around the table. And one of the most embarrassing things is to say things that seem to be unrealistic, right? And I understand him, right? And because and it's not his fault, there have been presidency after presidency which has failed to sort of describe any kind of big picture, and the result is now that even relatively small pictures become largely unrealistic. And and there's one great chance we have. There's no inflation, debt is free, sometimes actually gives us money, and we have really important common European needs. I stress defence, but I actually think you can spend on infrastructure. There's lots of infrastructure you could be spending on. And if you don't want to do it, well, we've tried this before in the 1930s and it worked. We didn't do what was needed, and we had the results that we had. All right? I'm sorry, I hope I've been sufficiently optimistic.
Copenhagen criteria, Poland.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, everybody knows the story. I mean, we basically have two governments which feel fundamentally constrained by the rule of law, by democratic rule of law. We have a government in Poland which won a parliamentary majority, but which has 235 MPs in the lower house and needs 307 to change the constitution. So it decided it would just create a crisis which would allow it to ignore the constitutional court and behave as if it had 307 MPs, right? I mean, and obviously this in no way can be reconciled with the Copenhagen criteria. It's of course a massive problem for Europe, because Europe is a club of democratic countries, and you're not democratic if you behave as if you'd won 307 seats when you've got 235. And, what is Europe going to do about it? And the kind of solution that these people are thinking about is, well, Erdogan gets away with it. Let's have a sort of special second-tier membership where we'll be allowed to get away with this. We'll still call ourselves members of the European Union, but we won't have to worry about these kinds of unpleasant things. They haven't thought through the fact that they then won't get European funds, but in the end, if they had to choose between ruling and not having the money, they'd choose the power over the money. I think that's all I've got to say. And that applies to Hungary as well.
I was asked about Spain and Portugal. I think that proves that the Stability Pact by now has become not only not respected but irrelevant. And nobody raised eyebrows, even at the news, not dismissed, that the finance minister of Germany appears to have called some of his colleagues on the ECOFIN Council to urge them not to apply the sanctions against Spain and Portugal. And when either the macroeconomy or strictly political friendship stands in the way of applying the rules in a community of rules, something needs to be changed, I believe. If I may, concerning the European Council in Bratislava or elsewhere, I'm not sure it was a good invention to begin with when it was put in place. It might have become a good thing if it had understood itself as a body of the greatest authority working within a pipeline of decision-making. Just think of what were the consequences of the fact that in December '99, at the European Council of Helsinki, the French president decided, induced the others to accept the idea, all of a sudden, without any commission preparation, that the following day a representative of the European Union should go to Ankara to virtually promise early accession. How many frustrations have been generated by that? The European Council could be a high political body for the broad picture. I have been a member of it only for 1.5 years, but certainly during that critical period it has not. It was a duplication, of course not with the same degree of competence of the ECOFIN Council, and I happened to participate to both, so I could compare. And let me conclude with an anecdote. In September 2012, so that is 4 years ago, I once suggested to President Van Rompuy, because I was impressed of the total technicality of European councils. Mind you, I was among 28 the only non-politician, but supposedly technocrat, and yet I was surprised by the total lack of a political dialogue. So I propose that one session should be devoted to a discussion among heads of governments on what was beginning to happen in Europe in terms of nationalism, populism, and whether there might have been a link between EU policies or the way they were communicated and these emerging phenomena. He said, what a good idea, we never did that. And after the meeting of the two of us, he said to the press, we will have once a European Council on this. The following day, a person I respect enormously, the German Chancellor, called me saying, Herman said this to me, I also think that it is a good idea, but please not now. Let's first solve definitively the Greek crisis. I'm not sure that any political discussion of this sort has taken place, and maybe it's now too late.
I would like to address the question that Pavel Demes asked, and I fully understand where it comes from, because both Pavel and I are actually, our roots are in civil society and think tank and so on, and in public policy. And I'm sorry that my colleague Ambassador Korchov is not here, because he's actually the government plenipotentiary who is also in charge of preparation of the summit next week in Bratislava. But the problem is exactly what Mario mentioned, that there is unfortunately not enough discussion, there is not enough time spent by the leaders, and there is, I think finance leaders are probably even better than the others. And I was, as Minister of Economy, I was also part of the Energy Council and the Competitiveness Council, etc. But there is just not enough substantive and substantial discussion. And I think it's a huge problem. So for the council, for the meeting of 27 next week in Bratislava, this is all basically handled primarily in terms of substance by the cabinet of Donald Tusk. That's the reality. In terms of substance, we have almost, I don't know, I think Ivan Korčok will have to answer, but I think very little input, mostly logistics on our side. But at the same time, I think that we have to, and we have the obligation to come up with these bottom-up initiatives, that we have to push ideas, we have to push politicians to get engaged into discussion and to listen to new ideas. Actually, Globsec Institute does have an initiative in mind, which would be in parallel to the kind of second-track diplomacy, parallel to the official process of Bratislava, Malta, Rome. And we hope that Mario will be co-chairman or chairman, whatever, of this group, but we'll see. I know he's very busy with budgetary and other issues. Anyway, the idea is to exactly generate this bottom-up thinking and new ideas which would be channeled to the leaders and push the leaders to make real decisions, not just blah blah, as we say. So I'm sorry that even having the presidency, there is not enough opportunity to really push new ideas and bold decisions. That's the reality of the European decision making, but I think it should not constrain us, those who want change, to push it in a different way.
Friends, the good positive message that I take from today's discussion and panel is that the situation might get really worse. For example, through external shock coming, say, from America or elsewhere in the world, if we don't do reforms at national level, if we don't calibrate well the coordination of fiscal policies at European level, so that they do not suffocate economies, but also introduce some discipline. If I were to use three adjectives of the mood of the discussion, I would say realistic, sober, pragmatic. And pragmatism is really a mot de jour these days, and I would end maybe with one final sentence. I hope that co-speakers would agree with me. If you have visions, go to the doctor. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the speakers.